Hello, everyone. I'm here with Chartered Environmentalist Dan Reading CEnv, Head of Sustainability at World Sailing, and the 2021 Environmental Professional of the Year, as announced at the virtual CEnv Awards results event on the 4th of June. So can I start off by saying a huge congrats, Dan. In the last week, we've gone out to the CEnv community asking for questions for you, and I've received a number of questions back. So I'm just going to ask some of those questions today, if that's okay. So to start with, if I just ask you to give your reaction to winning this award, can you sum up what it means to you to be crowned Environmental Professional of the Year?
Yeah, well, first, hi, nice to speak with you. And yeah, I mean, it was a shock, that's for sure. A nice one, and as you know, we were away on holiday, so I certainly had a spring in my step for that week. For me, it's been fantastic because so I worked with, for example, David Stubbs, who was the first environmentalist professional of the year, environmental professional of the year. So to kind of follow in his footsteps and knowing the amount of amazing CEnvs out there and the strength of all those applicants, yeah, it was amazing to win.
Brilliant, and very much well deserved as well. So just moving on to another question, and we know it's been obviously a very challenging year for everybody, but you've managed obviously to thrive, have reflected in this award, which obviously recognises achievements over the course of your career, but also particularly within the last 12 months. So apart from this award, what are you most proud of achieving in this year?
Yeah, it's certainly been a challenging year, that's for sure. I think for me, there's been a number of, I guess because we have such a broad sustainability strategy and a number of programs going on, there's still work that we could try and complete. So for me, firstly, we had a big push for educational materials. So we produced this program for 6 to 12-year-olds, put it in 12 different languages. We have about 25 countries using that, about 100,000 kids going through it. So that's been good. And in some ways, the lockdown has kind of made, I suppose, parents looking for activities, certainly the first lockdown anyway, I know from experience, trying to find different activities that would be engaging for the kids. So that's something that I suppose timed quite nicely. As well as that, we had grassroots programs, so specifically aiming at club infrastructure, so how people can carry out self-audits and reduce their environmental impact, rolling that out globally. We've already had about 25 clubs all over the world participate in that, and that's been great, so you can see improvements being made. And I think as well, with some of the initiatives, one in particular, which is where it's called Challenge 2024, working with the Paris 2024 Olympics and challenging the marine industry to shift away from the use of combustion engines. So I'll probably talk about that in a little bit more detail later, but we could start to see the ripple effect of that challenge to the industry and how that's had a really big impact. So that's been really fulfilling to see that take place. And then finally, we also, World Sailing won the GACE Award, which is the Global Association for International Sport Federations, and we won the Sustainability Award there. So considering we're relatively small compared to other big sporting federations, that was great to achieve that as well. So it's been a bumpy year.
Wow, that's impressive. Congrats on all that. And yeah, like you say, it's been one busy year, and also great to hear about all the sort of education side of things you're doing. Obviously, we at CEnv, we really believe that's a really important part of sustainability. So if I just go on to the next question, sort of sticking with this theme, as part of your role at World Sailing, which you've mentioned, you've led the development and delivery of this sustainability strategy, Sustainability Agenda 2030, which is widely regarded as the most developed in sport. Tell us a bit about this strategy and the aims and what you've achieved so far.
Sure. Well, it started in 2017. We got a group of individuals together, kind of experts in different fields. We sat in a room for 2 days, tried to work out, where all the opportunities are. It was a bit like trying to define what the meaning of life is. So there was just so much appetite, so much opportunity, which was really quite exciting. We then came up with a big list of, okay, these are the things through an organization that effectively owns the rules of the sport. There's a lot we can do through regulation within sport, not legal, as well as the education and equipment supplying and all that kind of stuff. So what we did is come up with a big list, which was ambitious. We then had a global consultation. We heard back from we engaged with 75 countries. So had really good feedback. So we sort of adjusted it. That was about 4 months. We then had a vote where all of our governance structure came together, which is effectively 146 countries. And to my amazement, it was the first time they agreed, so they unanimously supported it. And bearing in mind, there's some really challenging targets within that strategy. So we have targets which were at the time, so to be achieved in 2018 all the way to 2030. In total, there's 56 targets, and they range from, well, we contribute to 12 of the SDGs. So they range from life cycle assessment, gender equality, water quality, plastic use, equipment, renewable energies. So there's quite a lot in there, and it's certainly a challenge to work towards it. But that's something that I think the process of getting engagement with industry, participants, users, that's something that sports entities, I think all over the place, sort of in hindsight, the way that we did that has worked quite well because we've got such good buy-in, and I think that's being replicated now across the world of sport.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like some great work's already been done, and then sort of going forward, there's much to build on as well. So thank you for that. So if I just move on to your role as co-chair of the UNFCCC's, it's a bit of a mouthful that, isn't it? Sports for Climate Action Framework. So obviously you're engaged not only with sailing, but sustainability across sort of the sporting world. So we've received some questions around that sort of general topic, and I just move on to this question. So international sport, it's amazing. I would agree with that. I'm a big sports fan myself. But obviously the logistics involved must cause huge environmental impacts. How can this be combated? What are some of the leading ideas being considered for addressing these impacts? Quite a big question there.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. And it ranges hugely dependent on sport, which type of sport. So Tom Daley going to the Olympics, you know, all he has to pack is a pair of Speedos, I think. And when you compare it to sports like sailing, obviously you've got a boat, a support boat, and all of the safety equipment, etc. So when we look at the different sports in terms of the equipment, and that has to be shipped. So logistics for that is challenging. I say it has to be shipped. There's other possibilities in terms of having supplied equipment in country, and this is just for international competition, sort of, you know, the Olympics, World Cups, those kind of events. So one of the other things for international sports is that in terms of officiating, you can't really. So if you're having a World Cup in England, say it was a Football World Cup, all the referees couldn't be English because there'd be a potential issue there. So again, with international sporting events, you also have not only the athletes and support teams, but actually some of the officiating, you have international officials as well. So I think some of the best practice, what people are starting to look at, is what can be done remotely. I think we're seeing an exponential growth in terms of the technology that's available, how it's being applied to sports entities, teams. For us, things like automated marks. So we have a buoy which we sail around, and there's now been basically development in terms of you can have robotic autonomous marks which can be controlled almost anywhere in the world, and it just takes down the number of people that are required to make that event happen. So I still think it's a big challenge, which in terms of logistics, which sports are facing, but there's certainly a lot of logistics companies, organizations that are involved with the sponsoring of these events. So it's something that they're all working towards. I think the really big events that, you know, the Olympics and the Football World Cups, etc., there's been a shift away from building built infrastructure to low carbon, either using existing infrastructure or temporary. rather than building these kind of big stadia which aren't used in the future. Of course, there's a balance between having legacy projects, so you've got infrastructure that can be used in the future, and the Queen Elizabeth Park's a great example of that, versus are they going to be in locations where they're not going to get good use long term. So that's something that I think is being more and more focused on, as well as I think intelligent calendars. So for some international sporting events, you could see an event in Europe, then 1 week, then America the next, then back in Europe. So really making sure that, you know, it doesn't really, well, it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons, but trying to make those more efficient, and trying to make conflicting events. So certainly in the sailing world, there's different sort of categories of sailing event, and some athletes will participate in both. So making sure that you know, they're not conflicting in terms of timing.
Yeah, some great points there. I think particularly when you're talking about the sort of calendars and making sure they sort of make most sense. I'm thinking particularly of tennis, where they sort of go from one place to the other, don't they? And so you think that it could make more sense in terms of the scheduling and stuff. And also, obviously, like you raise a good point about fairness there as well, with the refereeing. So yeah, lots to think about there.
Just whilst I was thinking, I mean, there's other things like, and I'm sure it's becoming more topical, definitely, where, I mean, certainly now where we've got so pitch sports like football, where at the moment there hasn't been many fans, but if you're having something like a Champions League final with 2 English teams, but it's being played in Istanbul or somewhere like that. So actually, I think in the future, the rights holders, the people that are organising those events, may have to be slightly more flexible. Like, do we need to announce where the final is going to be played sort of a year in advance before we know who's competing? Because, you know, the 2 teams, so 11 aside plus support crew, so maybe 50 people from each team, so 100 people going from England to Istanbul, not massive impact. But if you've got 60,000 fans, then that's a completely different story. So I think it's that trying to weigh up what's possible, and I'm sure there's different commercial and broadcast reasons, but I think that with COVID and the flexibility that a lot of sports have had to implement, I think that we hopefully should see some changes in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. That came up again this year, I guess, with the Champions League final. I think they wanted to have fans, didn't they? So it was in Portugal. But yeah, there's always complications, I guess, and different factors to take into account. But I suppose we would just argue that the environmental factors should be sort of prioritised. So yeah, great points there. So if I just move on to the next question. So given the extreme amount of money in some sports, what kind of impact could a small percentage of this cash being diverted to offset the environmental impacts of sport have? Quite a good question there as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because when I talk about, so the sport I know very well, sailing, for example, you do have extremes where you've got your kind of grassroots, very you know, it's relatively cheap sport. You can buy a boat for a couple of £100, to all the way up to America's Cup teams where they're operating on a Formula One type budget. So I think that in terms of offsetting, I think that's kind of scraping the surface. I think it's it's something that definitely all sports entities should be doing at the high level, but that's kind of just getting their own house in order. I think the ability for sport, and this is quite what I find it quite an exciting prospect, to engage with the fan base, the supply chain. I think there's lots more that they can do on top of offsetting their own emissions. And for the UN FCCC Sports for Climate Action Framework, we now have, I checked the other day, 247 signatories. So effectively all of them have committed to reducing their carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. And actually most of them are doing it in advance of the Paris Agreement in terms of dates, and also offsetting, compensating, and a lot of them being carbon positive. So for me, I think when we talk about the extreme amounts of money and the top end of sports, I do think that there's a few types of sport where actually the thing that I find quite exciting again is that where you have these what we call applied technologies. So for instance, with Formula One, they have some of the teams have applied technologies departments where I guess it's kind of off season, or it's another way of generating income, where you've got the top mechanical engineers, designers in the world for a set amount of time designing fast cars or whatever it might be. But actually, if they can apply their expertise to different issues, then there's lots of opportunity there. And I think there's a good example where I think it's Williams F1 team designed an aero wing, which is to go on fridges to make them more efficient. And Sainsbury's have implemented that across, I think it's something like 800,000 fridges across all of them in the UK. So it's using that expertise to come up with lower carbon sort of technological solutions. And within the marine sector, so with the for us the pinnacle is the America's Cup. They sort of have applied technologies where now they're looking at hydrogen propulsion. Also, a few years ago, they started to do something called foiling, which is effectively flying. So you've got hydrofoils in the water, and it makes the boats faster, more extreme. So from a spectator's point of view, it's great. But in terms of efficiencies, it makes the boat much more efficient because you've got much less drag. And we're starting to now see that being applied to some kind of some recreational boats, but then also kind of commercial boats, so water taxis and those kind of things. So hugely reducing the emissions. So I think that for me is where, when you've got large R&D budgets, if that can influence the wider industry to be more sustainable, where your sport, some of these sports do attract like the top designers, engineers, etc. So if you can use their brilliance and apply it to other industries to reduce the environmental impacts, I think there's some great opportunities there, and hopefully we'll see more examples of that in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's some great innovation being done, isn't there? And like you say, great minds being brought into sport. So absolutely, I think it's really exciting actually, some of the things that can be done. Just moving on to the next question. So this one is, tell us a bit about the work being done to address environmental impacts in grassroots sport and how this compares to elite sport. Because obviously, yeah, it's not just obviously the elite end. So do you have any sort of insights on that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to World Sailing, I worked for the national governing body in the UK, and there I spent most of my time working with grassroots, so looking at club infrastructure, doing environmental audits at clubs, and so it's an area which, in terms of the number of grassroots clubs, it kind of, because there's across globally there'll be millions of clubs, so its overall environmental impact is more significant than the elite professional sport, although the elite professional on the kind of one type of events like an Olympics or something is absolutely huge. So in terms of scaling, looking at solutions and working with clubs, that's something that I think a lot of federations are taking very seriously, and something that we, as I mentioned at the top, that we've designed sort of self-assessments, which gives an intelligent report about how one can make a club more sustainable. We have energy checklists, we have all of that. So it's difficult to be able to have one-to-one interactions with all of the grassroots clubs. So what we try to do is give provisions of resources that they can access and use them themselves. So I think that something which is which I kind of found through grassroots clubs is they can act, I mean, as I'm sure you know, they act as community centres in some instances. I think that a club might be able to invest in certain technologies because it's typically clubhouses are going to have been there for 100 years and they hopefully will be there for the next 100 years. So rather than residents maybe being a bit sort of uncertain about investing in something like a ground source or air source heat pump, what we're finding is quite a few clubs are doing this because they look at a longer return on investment, and actually I've come across lots of clubs whereby somebody is, or basically the committee have decided, right, let's install an air source or water source heat pump, And then you find that sort of 3, 4, 5 years later, quite a few of the members start to, because they can see it in action. So they haven't taken the risk initially, but they've kind of seen the benefits, and then they've started to use that at home. So I do see kind of grassroots club infrastructure as a way of sort of showcasing almost some of the environmental technologies that can also be replicated in the home. So yeah, that's, I think as well, the similarities in terms of equipment for elite athletes and grassroots in some sports, like sailing, for example. The Olympic sailors for some classes of boat, like a laser, they're also used hugely throughout the grassroots. So actually there is a synergy there because they're using the same equipment. So as a federation with the ability to change the rules in that equipment, so for example, we're specifying life cycle assessment, 90% of the boat by weight has to be recyclable, all of those kind of metrics for the future, which will eventually trickle down to the grassroots. So it's hugely important, and I think as well it's the best way to engage with the majority through grassroots initiatives.
Yeah, brilliant. I think it's really interesting that actually to hear sort of the power of the sort of setting a good example at the elite level, and then the way that can trickle down into grassroots. And I think just sort of giving clear examples of how you can improve your environmental impact is useful, isn't it? Because I think there's a lot of people that want to reduce their impact, but they don't know sort of how to go about it. So if you give them sort of clear examples of how they can do it, then you know, people can achieve a lot of great stuff. So fantastic. So if I just move on to some questions relating to the environmental profession more generally. So obviously you're a chartered environmentalist, and you hold your CEnv registration via your membership of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, IEMA. What role would you say that has your professional registration and membership had in shaping your career so far?
A huge impact, I think. I mean, I remember when I cast my mind back to when I was first starting and doing my associate IEMA kind of application and some of the various courses, which for me at the time it was kind of like, well, I think as well the environmental profession has developed hugely in terms of, well, in a number of ways, but in terms of what is now expected of an environmental manager to be literate in all these different topics. It does require an element of CPD. So I think for me, it was kind of the first kind of when I came across IEMA and looking at the different courses to learn more and basically gain more experience. Once I was kind of a member, then a full member, there was lots of events that I would attend, same with CEnv in terms of networking. And I think for me, that's been critical, just to sometimes you can find yourselves sort of working in a silo as an environmental professional. That's not always the case, but actually speaking with colleagues and friends in different industries or similar industries, but working on similar projects, that's really what you need. It kind of motivates you, hear about some great other initiatives, technologies, etc. So I think I'm always an advocate of kind of joining these kind of professional bodies to make sure that as an individual you can mature and learn from others.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think you know, obviously at CEnv we really believe in sort of the sharing of good practice, and particularly, like you say, across the sectors, because obviously we bring together professionals from across the profession that represent, you know, a really wide spectrum of different disciplines. So I think, you know, it's only going to be a positive for people to share their good practice with each other. So fantastic. Sort of a related question maybe, but what message would you give to younger environmental professionals developing their careers? So can you identify one or two top tips maybe that based on your experience? Yeah,
well, I guess well, certainly the networking aspect of it, and I suppose now with COVID, we're doing everything digitally. But for me, even things like LinkedIn, it's kind of, you know, almost every day I'll have a quick kind of scan, and it's like opening kind of so I get the IEMA magazine as well, but almost daily you can see all the different initiatives. So as a young professional starting out, to get a good understanding of what companies are doing, what NGOs are doing in these kind of areas, I think is going to really build your confidence in what you can apply to your own setting. And also, yeah, actually network with individuals, speak to them, find out about what events or what challenges they've got, and seeing if you can be a conduit between some. I think that's always positive. And I think the one piece of advice that I would say to kind of budding environmental professionals is sort of find your niche. I mean, there are people who are more generalists, which is, you know, there's certainly a market for that. But for me, I think what I've tried to do is find a niche, and for me it would be sport and the marine sector. And I think that's kind of meant that I can channel my energies into that and use all of the examples across those two sectors and apply them.
Absolutely, you've sort of developed your expertise within that area and obviously made a big impact within your field as well. So that makes total sense, and some great advice there. So just moving on to sort of a question about diversity and inclusion. So we know that the environmental profession needs to be more diverse and inclusive. Currently, it rates quite poorly when it comes to its performance in that area. So obviously, we've had the establishment of programs like the Diverse Sustainability Initiative, which CEnv is involved with. Are there any good practices you've seen in your career that have helped to increase diversity and inclusion, would you say?
I think, well, quite a few sports, including sailing, does have its own challenges with diversity and inclusion. I think there are some sports that have dealt with these topics very well, and I think for us, one of the things that we first did, I mean, it sounds fairly obvious, but finding out exactly, surveying all of the different, I suppose, individuals that participate. So what are the challenges, looking at infrastructure, is it equipment? So I think the first aspect would be benchmark, find out what the current gaps are. We also found through that research, and something that again might link to the kind of environmental profession, is are there some either geographical areas, or what we found is certain countries didn't have so much of a drop off in certain demographics, or actually they had a much more diverse sort of fan base or people that are participating, and trying to explore the reasons of how they've got to that point. And something that came back time and time again was that I think what people need is role models that, you know, look, or they've got similar attributes to them, so they can see themselves in those roles. So it's either spotlighting or showcasing where you've got individuals from these groups to effectively try and make the sector slightly more diverse and inclusive.
Absolutely. I think the sort of power of inspiration, isn't it? Like the saying, you know, you can't be what you can't see, or what you don't see. So I think that's really important. So yeah, brilliant words there, I think. And if I just come to the final question, so obviously as an award-winning professional, where do you go from here? What are your key sort of aims and ambitions going forward?
That's a really good question. I think for me, I really want to, I suppose, get sport to a place where it realizes its full potential, in terms of getting its own house in order is one thing, but it's engaging with the, like, global sport engages with about 3 billion people. In the US, you have something like, there's a stat that about 15% of people in the US would read or follow scientific journals, or those kind of documents, whereby there's about 70% that follow sport. So actually, if you can channel, and this, I'm a great believer in, where you've got people who are following or participating in sport, they're doing it in their downtime, and I think they're much more open to environmental messaging or education about either their activity or how that links to what they're doing at home and business. So for me, I think that's absolutely key, making sure that sport uses its potential in the environmental space. But then also, kind of on top of that, is the carbon literacy. So what I absolutely love, and, you know, this is something that we've pushed out in our sport, but actually how that can be achieved in other sports. And I talked about that huge fan base, trying to get carbon literacy through different, either having profiling key athletes who are happy to talk about it, looking at what the sports are doing themselves, if it's the sponsors, the supply chain, as well as also having things like standardized life cycle assessment approaches across our industry. And I think, so some, I suppose, lofty ambition or goals there, and maybe there's going to be a few challenges to get there. But for me, I think there's still so much potential, so much more to do, and I'm really excited to work on some of those projects.
Brilliant. It all sounds very exciting. So yeah, hopefully we can, continue to support you as CEnv, and obviously I know IEMA as well, as a professional body, in sort of, achieving your goals. So fantastic. So thank you. And all that leaves me to say is obviously thanks so much, Dan, for giving me your time today. And also thanks to everyone who submitted questions as well and helped made the CEnv Award so successful this year. So yeah, thank you, and all the best for the rest of 2021.
Pleasure. Thanks very much. Nice to speak with you.
Thank you. Bye.